Hi, we're beginning a series of 3 messages from the healing ministry of Jesus. And a particular thing strikes me about the 2 intended healings that occur in the passages for today. And that's that stuff, very importantly, happens on the way. When Jesus is setting out to get to where he needs to get to, while he's still walking the roads, then there's a development, something happens, messengers come, the scene changes. So let's have a quick look at that. But before we do, just want to draw attention to something which I'm going to mention in each of the 3 messages. And that is that the healing ministry of Jesus, I think, is best understood with a quick reference back to the very beginning of the Bible itself, Genesis chapter 1. It follows quite reasonably from there, because of course the creator, who wants to create everything good, becomes concerned when something in the creation is not good. Now the creator has created a creation with a potential to not work out, and it's called the creation of life, I think, because it's in the very nature of life, of living stuff, that there's a measure of unpredictability and a freedom of choice, a freedom of being. And God has intentionally created life. And within that life creation, human beings who have a particular capacity for choice. And I think we need to just grab this before we look at the healing ministry. Of course, that this freedom is hazardous, but it has a great potential. Freedom is one in which we can choose to be good. We are not genetically wired so that we have to be good. God has not pre-programmed us like good robots who can only ever be moral and nice. Rather, loving your neighbour as yourself and loving God for all you're worth, those are choices. Choices you don't have to make, choices we're free to make. So it's a particular kind of creation that we're part of, but it's bound to be the case that the creator, when the creation becomes broken, hurt, malfunctioning, damaged in some way, will want to bring about healing. And of course that's the great Christian hope, which is the ultimate healing of all creation through Christ. And Jesus indicates that by bringing forward, in some cases, that final healing into the midst of his own ministry. So it's like he's bringing the final order of things into the middle of the current realities. Okay, that's a bit heavy. Let's do some brain stuff instead. So we'll do something about the periaqueductal brain, or the PAG, with apologies to neuroscientists who end up watching this and wondering why on earth I'm talking about that. Well, my understanding, as a casual observer, is that recent science has taken an interest in the PAG, the periaqueductal brain. It's a little bit of your grey matter, your brain between your ears. It's quite deep. And this area of the brain is busy when you are being spiritual. In other words, when you're doing stuff that you consider to be spiritual. But by and large, let's not get into defining spiritual. Let's just say, when you would call yourself spiritual, or to a particularly spiritual moment, then that's an area of the brain that's working on it. Interestingly, but not surprising to the followers of Jesus perhaps, is that the same area of the brain, the PAG, is also active when you're being kind, when you're being compassionate, when you're doing what Jesus would call loving your neighbour as yourself. And this area of the brain, therefore, reminds me that the business of being spiritual is not separate from the business of being physical. And that's a feature of the healings of Jesus. They show us that God treats us not as two kinds of being, a physical you and a spiritual you. God just created you. God just loves you. And God actually ultimately intends complete healing for you, the whole you. And so don't be surprised, in fact be delighted by this reminder from neuroscience that the spiritual you and the physical you are all wrapped up together. And guess what? Love, the choice to love, is right there in the middle of it. Let's think about the centurion's servant and that healing for a minute, and then we'll look at the other two. There's some things which bring these healings together and which are about common themes. And one of them, as I've said, is the business of Jesus being on the way between places, going from one place to another in order to bring the healing and the help that's required. Well, on this particular occasion, he's on the way to give the help that's needed. And he's keen to get there. But before he gets there, a message comes from the centurion to this effect. No, I didn't mean for you to come to my house. I know that you can't come to my house, but you don't need to, because you don't need to meet me, you don't need to meet my servant who I want you to heal. It's like this. I'm a centurion, so I'm under authority. I'm governed from somebody higher up the chain. And you are somebody I recognise to be under God's authority. There's somebody higher over you, if you like. And now also as a centurion, I'm not just under the authority of my boss, but actually that same boss gives me authority over others. And your boss, God, gives you authority over sickness. All you have to do from wherever you are is give the command, and I'm sure it will happen. So let's not break the rules. Don't come to my house. I'm torn, folks, between whether I wish Jesus had gone. No, I'm coming anyway. But I think it's actually better that he didn't. He made the decision to honour the centurion's way of negotiating something. What was it he was negotiating exactly? Well, if you look at the passage with care, you'll see that the centurion is a foreigner. This has enormous consequences in the social setting in which he is. He's there as a soldier, I think, of Herod the king, and he's got a very unpopular job to do. He's there to impose an authority on the Galileans that they don't really want. But he's decided to make a good job of it. He's a foreigner, and that means he's separated from the people he must look over and get to behave. He's separated from them by their perceptions of race and by their perceptions of religion. The two are inseparable in this particular instance. So he has to be separate, but he's begun to break down the barriers. He decided to sponsor the building of their religious centre in the little town, the synagogue. So he has sponsored their faith for their people, and he is a foreigner to it. He doesn't even have access to go in the synagogue, and he can't have any of these people in his home, and he won't mess up their lives by going into their homes either. So he respects the situation as it is, but he begins to erode the separations from people. I think Jesus sees an opportunity, somebody who is actually quite like-minded in some ways. Jesus also wants to start breaking down those barriers. So he sets out to go to the guy's home. That's when the guy sends messages, says, no, I didn't mean for you to come to mine. You can't. All you have to do is command and it will happen. Jesus is blown away by this. He said, I can't believe what I'm hearing. A person who doesn't even belong to our faith and our people is showing more faith than I've found in our own. And it's mind-boggling. So Jesus is surprised by somebody, and not many people ever got to surprise Jesus. One more we'll talk about in a minute. So why was this so important to me? Well, lots and lots of reasons, but this week has been a particular week since the defeat by Italy of the English team in the finals of the Euro, and the racist outbursts which followed, and indeed the widespread condemnation of that racism. And I think it's just a good idea to remember that racism is a myth. Not racism, but the racial division is a myth created by culture. It's not biologically accurate. In other words, as genetics have shown since somewhere around the early 70s, and increasingly now, absolutely, with the Human Genome Project, etc., you are not genetically more different from people of other races than you are from people of your own race. It's about the same. So yes, race has some genetics attached to it, but everything else has genetics attached to it. So the people who are most like you genetically are not those of your own race necessarily. Just as likely to be the nearest person to you genetically is just as likely to be somebody from another race. In other words, the whole race thing itself is a fabrication. It's created by our cultures over the long, long history of humanity. I don't know the factors that have created it, but here it is. It's a myth, folks. Anyway, which simply means that racism is an act of ignorance as well as an offence against the Creator. Well, move on. The other thing that's striking is that the beneficiary of all this is a slave, the lowest person in the social setup. Now, in the next healing, a little girl is not much higher than a slave, if higher. In other words, in their culture, to be female was to be lower down the pecking order than to be male, and to be a child was to be lower down the pecking order than to be an adult. To be a girl was low down the social structure. Jesus has plenty of time to go and heal this little one. On the way, while he is still on the road, messengers come, just as they did from the centurion, this time from the home where the little girl lives with her dad, Jairus. And the messengers say, it's too late, the moment's passed, Jesus is no longer relevant because she's died. Well, Jesus says to Jairus, listen, you have a certain amount of faith. Now you hang on to it until we get home. You just keep trusting what you know to trust. You have recognized the presence of God here and the power of the Creator to restore creation. You hang on to that, and you and me will go home, and your daughter's going to be okay. There's a message in that about the whole way we approach death and the whole promise of the final restoration of all things, even beyond death itself. But I just got to finish with this person who surprises Jesus in a completely different way to the centurion. She also, like Jairus and like the centurion, demonstrates a remarkable kind of faith, and it impresses Jesus in a very different way. Because first of all, Jesus had no intention of healing her at all. He didn't know she was there. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know her need. And after she was healed, through pushing through the crowd to touch the edge, the fringe of his clothing, he just knows that somebody's been healed, but he doesn't even know who it is. And I love that fact. I love the fact that Jesus is taken by surprise and is at a loss. He's saying, well, there's somebody here, and the disciples are saying, you can't say that, Lord, there's loads of people pressing against you. See, the thing is, the nature of her condition meant that she was not allowed to touch people and not allowed to let others touch her. She probably knew that Jesus normally touched people when giving healing, And therefore she probably thought, I'll have to just steal my healing by touching him without him being aware. But such is the situation, and I find this absolutely fascinating. He didn't intend to heal, but he could feel, he could sense somehow that he had been used by his Father in heaven to bring a healing to this woman. He insists on knowing who she is, because God is always interested, not just in a road show of miracles and sensations. That doesn't interest God at all. Jesus wasn't interested in that. God is interested in meeting us. God is interested in us meeting God, in our encounters with God. So it's not just about handing out healing here, there, and everywhere. It's about personal encounter with God. Anyway, I hope I've given you some things to think about from these healings, the two that Jesus intended and the one that he didn't know about until it had happened. God bless you and keep you safe. Don't forget that as the restrictions lift, if you are somebody living in England, the restrictions lift, it's still important to love your neighbour as yourself.